The judge laughed as the 72-year-old veteran begged the court to honor his service, then tossed the case aside like garbage. Seconds later, the courtroom doors slammed open, and 4 generals in full-dress uniform marched in, silent and uninvited. The room froze. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a cold white glare on the polished floor and high, impersonal walls of the courtroom. The atmosphere was not one of justice, but of sterilized bureaucracy, a place where the weight of a man's sacrifice could be filed, stamped, and discarded. Jacob Monroe stood at the plaintiff's table like a monument misplaced, upright but weathered, his neatly pressed blazer betraying the frayed shirt collar beneath. His fingers gripped the edge of the podium as if holding it kept his dignity from slipping through his fingers. The stack of documents before him, service records yellowed with age, photos of shrapnel-scarred limbs, discharge notes, and unpaid medical invoices, was not just paperwork. It was his life, his pain, laid bare for strangers who refused to look past ink and margin. Judge Leonard Crane did not even pretend to care. Reclined like a king on his raised bench, his eyes flicked to the bailiff with a look of mild boredom. When Jacob spoke, his voice thin but resolute, the judge responded not with consideration but contempt, a smirk twitching across his lips before spilling into open mockery. "The court is not a veterans' memorial," he said, and the room darkened, not literally but emotionally, as a toxic hush fell, and then broke into scattered chuckles from the defense table. The county attorneys didn't hide their disdain. A few leaned back with arms crossed. One whispered to another and grinned, as if the suffering of an old soldier were nothing more than an amusing anecdote. Evan, barely 20, sat rigid in the gallery, the words carving into him like shrapnel. His grandfather, who once crawled through jungle mud under enemy fire, now stood humiliated under fluorescent lights, laughed at by men who had never worn boots outside a courtroom. Evan leaned forward, whispering through clenched teeth, "They're mocking you, Grandpa. For real justice, we'll need something bigger." But Jacob didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or plead. He merely looked at the judge with eyes hollowed by time and burden. Judge Crane waved him off mid-sentence. "Dismissed," he declared, brushing Jacob aside like a minor inconvenience, citing emotional irrelevance and no actionable harm. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy. No reporters lingered for comment. No one cared, except Evan. That night, in a silent living room, Evan uploaded the video. The audio was clear, the gavel, the laughter, the words, not worth the court's time. By dawn, those words echoed across the nation. The trailer was silent, but for the slow tick of the wall clock and the occasional metallic groan of wind pushing against rusted siding. The air inside was dry, heavy with the smell of old paper, coffee grounds, and motor oil that clung to Jacob's flannel shirts no matter how many times they were washed. Stacks of unopened envelopes lined the kitchen counter. VA correspondence, medical bills, utility cutoff warnings. On the coffee table, a foreclosure notice lay unfolded, its bold red stamp like a wound Jacob no longer had the strength to dress. He sat in a worn recliner that had molded itself to the shape of his body over 2 decades. His knees ached constantly now. The cold made it worse. One hand rested on his lap, the other traced the edge of a battered photograph in a wooden frame. 4 young men, arms draped over each other's shoulders, all grinning in camouflage under a setting sun. He whispered their names in his head: Thompson, Velez, Collins. Gone. He was the only one left. Across the room, on a narrow shelf, his purple heart glinted in the muted lamplight. He hadn't touched it in years, not because he didn't value it, but because it hurt to remember what it had cost. The explosion outside Pleiku had taken most of the feeling in his right leg and all of the man beside him. Yet Jacob had returned home with a quiet resolve, convinced that dignity lay in rebuilding, not in bitterness. Until now. The laughter in that courtroom still rang in his ears, sharp, derisive, unapologetic. Not from strangers in the street, but from men in suits paid with tax dollars whose eyes slid over his service like it was a traffic violation. They hadn't seen a soldier. They'd seen a nuisance. And in doing so, they'd broken something he'd tried to preserve all his life, the belief that he still mattered. Evan burst in, breathless and electric, his phone lit up like a war map. "Grandpa, they're angry. They're posting stories, pictures, letters. Iraq vets, Korean War guys, even a 97-year-old nurse from France. Everyone's saying your name." Jacob didn't speak. His jaw was tight, his stare fixed on nothing. Not because he didn't hear, but because he was listening to something deeper. The sound of the silence before a reckoning. Finally, he stood. The movement was slow but certain, like a man rising for roll call. "Then let them see," he said, voice graveled and unshaken. "Let them see what a forgotten soldier looks like when he remembers who he is." The courtroom, once a sterile chamber of routine motions and procedural yawns, pulsed now with an electric tension so thick it seemed to warp the very air. Judge Leonard Crane adjusted his robes and glanced disinterestedly at the day's docket, barely disguising his annoyance at having to preside over yet another wave of what he called patriotic tantrums. In his mind, the storm had passed. The media would move on, the veterans would tire, and the world would forget. That's how these things worked. He didn't realize yet that this moment would carve his name into history, and not on the side he expected. The double doors slammed open like a thunderclap. Conversations choked mid-sentence. Chairs scraped as startled onlookers half rose. In stepped 4 men, each a living monument to sacrifice and command. Their uniforms, immaculate, adorned with rows of service ribbons and medals that told stories no courtroom transcript ever could, shimmered with quiet defiance under the harsh ceiling lights. Generals McNally, Ortiz, Sloan, and Tompkins, names etched into military history, soldiers who had led battalions through the jungles of Vietnam, the sands of Fallujah, the mountains of Kunar, and the streets of Sarajevo. They didn't ask permission. They didn't seek audience. They moved with the authority of men who had earned silence through the sheer weight of their lives. Every eye followed as they marched in unison, not to the spectator benches, but directly to the plaintiff's table, where Jacob Monroe, frail but resolute, sat in his worn suit, his hand resting on a leather folder more brittle than it looked. The generals stood behind him, not as bodyguards, but as brothers in arms, their presence a shield against every gavel that had tried to diminish him. Judge Crane's gavel halted midair. The courtroom held its breath. Then, General Sloan spoke. His voice was calm but forceful, a voice used to carrying over gunfire and chaos. "This man was laughed at by a court he fought to protect. We are here to finish what he started." The county attorney shot up, flushed and indignant. "Under what authority?" General McNally met his gaze like steel meeting glass. "Our moral one," he said, then laid a thick sealed envelope on the clerk's desk. "And if that's not enough, perhaps this is." Inside was a petition, signed by 1.2 million citizens, endorsed by Joint Chiefs, supported by congressional oversight. It wasn't just paper. It was a reckoning. The room erupted. Reporters leapt to their feet. Phones pointed like rifles. The judge's face lost its color, his authority retreating before a truth too heavy to suppress. History had just entered the courtroom, and it wore stars. The world didn't shift with thunder or gunfire, but with the steady hum of headlines, the flicker of televised hearings, and the sudden hush in offices where bureaucrats once felt invincible. In less than 2 days, a story that began in a forgotten courtroom in Montana gripped the conscience of a nation. What had been dismissed as emotional noise was now a chorus of outrage echoing from Washington to Wichita. The Department of Veterans Affairs, forced from inertia into action, announced a sweeping federal inquiry into procedural failures, case mishandlings, and patterns of neglect spanning over a decade. What began with Jacob Monroe became a mirror held to the nation's face, and what it saw demanded consequence. Judge Crane was suspended indefinitely for misconduct. County officials tendered resignations under a flurry of press releases filled with hollow words: deep regret, commitment to reform, administrative oversight. But no apology could scrub away the footage now burned into the public's collective memory. The smirk, the chuckle, the dismissive gavel. And then came the invitation. When Jacob arrived in D.C., his breath visible in the cold marble corridors of the Capitol, the cameras fell silent. Not out of indifference, but reverence. He wore his old army dress jacket. The seams were a little tight, the buttons dulled, but the brass still gleamed with quiet defiance. At his side walked Evan, no longer just a grandson, but a witness to something historic. Inside the Senate Veterans Committee chamber, the atmosphere held a gravity usually reserved for state funerals and declarations of war. As Jacob entered, the room rose. Senators, aides, press, all on their feet. He did not speak with fire, nor dramatics. He didn't need to. "I was laughed at because I asked to be treated like a man who served his country," he said evenly, his voice gravel and wind. "I didn't come here today to be pitied. I came so no one else would ever be humiliated the way I was." No applause followed. Just silence. Respectful. Heavy. Earned. In the aftermath, the Monroe Bill was introduced, aimed at dismantling red tape and forcing accountability at every level of veteran services. Analysts called it a turning point. Veterans called it long overdue. Back in Montana, the changes were quieter, but no less profound. The foreclosure vanished. A new wheelchair ramp sloped gently to the porch where Jacob often sat at dusk. A service dog, black, calm, fiercely loyal, rested at his feet. And rising from the earth, just beyond the fence line, a flagpole flew the stars and stripes in crisp silence. Above the fireplace, framed under glass, hung a letter on official stationery. "Dear Mr. Monroe, you reminded this nation what respect looks like. Signed, General Sloan." He didn't smile for the cameras. Never had. But now, when the wind lifted that flag just right, Jacob Monroe allowed himself a rare expression. A small, enduring smile meant not for the world, but for the memory of every man who never made it home. Would you like a mid-journey prompt to visualize this final scene?